Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's National Conference of State Legislatures webinar, Green Means Go, What's Next for a New Federal Transportation Infrastructure Package. My name is Ben Hush with NCSL, and I'll be your moderator today. This is the third webinar in the Energy, Environment, and Transportation Fall 2020 webinar series, which we are hosting in lieu of the 2020 Legislative Summit in Indianapolis. Of course, we miss seeing everyone, but hopefully we can get through this pandemic together and see each other in person as soon as it is healthy and safe to do so. In addition to today's webinar, we have two more lined up over the course of the next few weeks, really on a variety of topics, including climate action opportunities in the agriculture sector and a discussion around the issues of permanently switching to daylight savings time. For a complete schedule and registration details, please visit ncsl.org. Before I introduce our two panelists today, I want to review a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is a platform for information exchange and engagement. Over the next hour or so, we encourage participation through our chat box, so feel free to type your questions and, of course, answer any questions in the chat box to the left of your screen. We, of course, all had plenty of time now. It seems to get used to these online platforms, so please do not be shy. To begin building a little bit of comfort with the chat function and also to learn who is online today, I invite each of you to type in the state from which you are currently calling in from. Let me just enter DC because I'm from DC. On our webinar today is being recorded, and registrants will be able to access a recording of it and the presentation slides on NCSL's website after the webinar completes. We will send out a notice once these resources are made available. Additionally, you can download the presentation slides used today by clicking the Resources tab and Speaker's Bio in the Speaker tab at any time during the presentation. Now that those housekeeping items are out of the way, let's get back to the main subject at hand. A common area of agreement amongst many state and federal policymakers is the need to increase investment in surface transportation infrastructure. But of course, the devil is really always in those details. With the authorization of federal surface transportation programs set to expire in 6 days, there are, of course, a host of questions concerning what transportation policy will look like going forward into 2021. We're going to do things a bit differently on today's webinar, and rather than have each of my great speakers give kind of their own presentation, I'm going to do more of a moderated conversation with our speakers to touch on many, but of course not all, of the key issues within federal surface transportation policy. And while I've prepared some slides and questions to help steer the conversation, please use the chat box to ask any questions throughout. You don't have to wait until the end, and I will try and make sure that we get to as many questions as we have time for. So without further ado, here with us today to help to explore and really dissect the many aspects of federal surface transportation policy are two great experts, Murphie Barrett and Paul Lewis. Murphie serves as the Vice President of Congressional Relations for Infrastructure Advancement at the Associated General Contractors of America. Prior to joining AGC, Murphie worked for two congressional committees, including as a staff director for the Highways and Transit Subcommittee, playing key roles in crafting several recent infrastructure laws, including the FAST Act. And Paul, he serves as the Vice President of Policy and Finance at the Eno Center for Transportation, a fantastic transportation think tank here in DC. He leads policy projects related to federal policy, transportation planning, transportation governance, and has extensive experience in transportation technologies, including, of course, automated vehicles, aviation, freight, public transit, pricing, and economic development. So with those introductions out of the way, to kick us off, Murphie, maybe I'll throw this first question to you. Maybe if you could just kind of help set the stage for our audience, from the 50,000 foot level and kind of what the current lay of the land is as of 3:07 Eastern on September 24th, 2020.
I'd be happy to. Hi, everybody, and thank you to NCSL for putting this webinar together and inviting me to participate. So, I think the short answer to your question, if I could answer it probably in one word, would be stalled. Right now, everything in Washington, D.C. and much across the country has been overcome by larger national issues, including but certainly not limited to the COVID-19 pandemic and the battle over the anticipated Supreme Court nomination that we're expecting to get underway later this fall in the Senate. You know, in terms of surface transportation reauthorization bill specifically, as Ben mentioned, you know, the FAST Act is set to expire in about 6 days. Earlier this week, the House of Representatives passed a bill to continue funding the federal government known as a continuing resolution. Attached to that continuing resolution, or CR, as we call it here in Washington, was a 1-year extension of the FAST Act. That will enable federal surface transportation programs to receive current levels of funding through September 30th, 2021. In addition, Congress provided another infusion of funding into the Federal Highway Trust Fund, which supports those programs, to the tune of $13.6 billion. The Senate did a procedural motion a short while ago to tee up consideration of the CR over there, and we are expecting the Senate to vote on the CR on Tuesday, and therefore, thankfully, averting a shutdown of the federal government. So that is the current lay of the land as we understand it right now.
Great. Paul, anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think that Murphy really summarized it well. You know, I would just say that you know, everything is pretty much stalled until after the election, and you know, there's a couple of reasons for that Murphy laid out. There's still you know, some hope that there's a COVID package that happens, maybe to help out the aviation industry and the transit industry, and you know, a few other subgroups of transportation have been lobbying pretty hard to get some additional relief funding. But really not a whole lot is expected to happen between now and until after the election.
Great. So now that we know kind of this key deadline, I want to kind of maybe spend a moment on what, if anything, took place kind of, you know, this Congress, the 116th. And so maybe Murphy, I'll go back to you to start us off. What did we see from the House or the Senate in terms of trying to move the next long-term authorization, kind of, you know, assuming that we might be able to get something done?
So to kind of take a sort of a chronological look at this, you know, and stepping back to calendar year 2019, you know, the first big step that we saw Congress take in terms of enacting a new surface transportation reauthorization bill was taken by the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. That committee has jurisdiction over the Federal Aid Highway Program. It's one of 3 authorizing committees in the Senate that play a pivotal role in enacting such legislation. So last July 2019, which, you know, I don't know for anyone else on the phone, that seems like a really long time ago now.
Yes.
They introduced and ultimately had a unanimous vote out of committee for their package to reauthorize the Federal Aid Highway Program to the tune of $287 billion over 5 years. You know, historically, we do see the Senate EPW committee really kind of kick off activity in the Senate that really sort of jumpstarts some of the other activities by the other 2 authorizing committees, which are the Senate Commerce Committee and the Senate Banking Committee. The Commerce Committee has jurisdiction, as you all know, over federal motor carrier safety programs, highway safety programs, and some research and freight activities. The Senate Banking Committee has jurisdiction over federal public transit programs. We understand that those other 2 authorizing committees continued to work on their respective titles of a surface transportation reauthorization bill. However, we didn't really see any further public showing of activity in the form of either of those committees either introducing their respective titles and subsequently marking them up. The Senate Finance Committee, which has the Herculean task of figuring out how to pay for this legislation and really kind of digging into some of the solvency issues facing the Federal Highway Trust Fund, also continued to work behind the scenes and hopefully coming up with a package to pay for the bill. But, you know, ultimately, we never really saw any further outward public action in the Senate on a surface transportation reauthorization bill.
Thanks. And maybe I'll throw this kind of next one to you, Paul. I mean, I know we saw a larger package from the House, and is that something that you see as a way forward, or do you, from Eno's point of view, see that more as kind of a messaging bill?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing about ATIA and then the INVEST Act is that they do kind of point towards what the future might be like, right? This Congress is not going to pass a multi-year reauthorization. We already know that. But next Congress will pretty much have to. And so depending on what happens in November, these bills could kind of give us insight into what to expect. So if we have a split Congress, as we do now, where the Democrats control the House and the Republicans control the Senate, I think a likely outcome is something similar to ATIA. A modest increase in funding, a continuation of the status quo in terms of the formulas, some tweaks and some additions on both sides for state of good repair and climate change, but nothing that dramatic departing from what we have, and something that's fairly bipartisan. If the Democrats are to take control of both chambers, and I think this is kind of regardless of what happens with the presidential race, you'd probably see something similar to the INVEST Act. Maybe not exactly like it, but a lot of these concepts come out of the Democratic caucus. Bigger investments, a ton of new programs were thrown into the INVEST Act, a big emphasis on climate change, performance requirements, discretionary grants were a big part of that. These, you got some of these points here on your slide, but much more of a departure from the status quo, a much more emphasis on kind of changing the federal policy, which in all practicality has not changed a ton since Safety Lou in 2005.
Thanks. So the next topic I want to bring is maybe best termed the elephant in the room, and that is, and Murphy, you addressed this a touch, the funding question. And I'm sure we all have heard many times the federal tax rates on gasoline and diesel fuel have not been increased in now close to 30 years. So I guess my question, kind of given the structural challenges that has kind of forced upon this Congress, as well as what it will force upon the next Congress, is a federal gas tax increase politically feasible? We've obviously seen states pass gas tax increases, especially over the last 5 years now. We're above more than half the states. So that's kind of the first question. And then the second one is, if not, what is the answer to the ongoing annual deficits in the Highway Trust Fund? And Paul, maybe I'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, so this is raising the gas tax and filling up the Highway Trust Fund and reducing its insolvency has been kind of an obsession for the transportation industry for the past 15 years, and it's something that Eno and myself, I would certainly advocate for increasing the fuel taxes and those kind of things. But the reality is that we've spent an awful lot of money and time trying to convince Congress that this is the right thing to do, and Congress has routinely ignored that call. And I don't think that we're any closer to increasing a fuel tax from Democrats or Republicans than we were 15 years ago. And it really seems like the only members of Congress that are supportive of increasing fuel taxes are those that have retired from Congress. And so while we keep talking about increasing fuel taxes to address the trust fund insolvency, we've kind of adopted a policy of mixed funding, right? The mixed funding approach is really kind of what the status quo has become. And it's actually a lot easier now than it used to be to find the money. The Ryan rule, which was around when Paul Ryan was Speaker of the House, required Congress to find an offset to not add to the deficit when we bailed out the trust fund. That rule no longer exists. So there's no reason or rationale or need to find a bail or some kind of offset. And so really the only thing you're doing is adding to the national debt, which Congress doesn't seem to have any issue with on either sides of the aisle, and that was a trend that had happened before COVID. And then the final piece on that is that the debt limit, this would add to the national debt, but the debt limit has been suspended until August or so of next year. So there's really, it's become somewhat simple to just put more money. I think has happened is we've spent so much energy trying to find some way to increase fuel taxes and shore up the trust fund that we haven't focused on the policy side of things and talked about how that money goes out. And so now we have a program that's 25% or more that's general funded, but looks a lot like the program of 15 years ago, which was much more of a 100% user-based system. And so I think what we've talked about is trying to encourage us not to think too much about the funding issue and raising fuel taxes, and more focusing on what are the national needs and what does the transportation policy look like to address those needs.
Great. And Murphie, obviously as a former staffer, anything that you might be able to add to that kind of now that you are on the outside?
Certainly a change being on the outside, but I do enjoy it. I think, certainly would agree, that Congress has more or less picked a de facto solution. Whether or not they've done that consciously or subconsciously, we could probably debate that. But yes, we've been transferring money predominantly from the general fund and a few other trust funds, into the highway trust fund since 2008. So, that's been 12 years of that activity. I think, Ben, to kind of answer the other part of your question, which is sort of the where do we go from here question, certainly AGC would love to see, federal fuel taxes increase. We've been one of those organizations that's been trying to, figure out how to convince Congress to do this for a number of years. And we've, certainly looked to what the states have been able to accomplish and kind of the incubators of some of these transportation funding solutions in recent years. But I think at a national level, the conversation is shifting more to a vehicle miles traveled or a mileage-based user fee of some kind. This seems to be the most promising solution, although this is not a solution that you could just sort of turn on tomorrow. To step back and look at the FAST Act briefly, one of the things that the congressional leaders involved in that legislation wanted to accomplish is they wanted to sort of test the concept of VMT. However, at that time, it wasn't really politically feasible for you to literally put vehicle miles traveled into federal legislation. There was a concern that it would raise a host of issues, not least of which had to do with privacy. So we created a pilot program for alternative user fees, which I imagine a number of the folks on the phone might be familiar with. And this program was meant to give competitive grants to states that were looking at, VMT and any other sort of user fees that they could come up with. Now what you've seen, 5 years later, is members of Congress on both sides of the aisle and in both political parties openly talking about, VMT being a possible solution in the years ahead for the Highway Trust Fund. Another issue that is sort of repeatedly talked about, and I think it goes to, some other comments, which is, are all of the quote-unquote users of the system paying into the system? One of the things that members of Congress will often talk about is electric vehicles. As we see a shift in federal policies, to encourage reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and deal with other issues related to climate change, a lot of the policy interest has focused on encouraging the deployment of electric vehicles and their usage and kind of building out the physical infrastructure necessary to support their usage. What usually quickly follows in those conversations are, well, those users aren't paying into the highway trust fund. How could we capture those users and what should we do? You know, the notion of an electric vehicle fee of some kind is discussed in policy circles, but it really hasn't been kind of tested politically. So I think those are some future issues that we'll continue to see Congress discuss. Both the House proposal, H.R. 2, Chairman DeFazio's Invest in America Act, which was ultimately incorporated into their larger infrastructure package, and the Senate ATIA legislation did include research and pilot program provisions to test VMT at a national level. So I think it's feeling pretty confident that the next reauthorization bill, when that comes, will start taking a hard look at a national VMT.
Great. Well, you provided the perfect segue to the next topic that I wanted to talk about. But before I ask that question, I do want to, your former boss, Chairman Schuster, definitely deserves credit for those provisions in the FAST Act now 5 years ago to kind of get this conversation started. I know that was a major priority for NCSL. We've started to see a number of states, as you mentioned, begin to pilot and implement this. And maybe, Paul, I might kind of throw this question over to you. Given some of the initial work on this topic being road usage charges, VMTs, I try and say RUCs more than VMTs, just if I look at the polling data. Is this something that you and your colleagues at the Eno Center see as something that can be scaled up to the federal level, or are we still a decade more away from a vehicle miles traveled, road usage charge, national system being something that is, for lack of a better word, sustainable at the federal level?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, something that has certainly been talked about for a long time. It's closer now to a reality than it's ever been. And certainly something that Eno has written a lot on. And it's not just, a vehicle miles traveled fee, but it's some of these roads that have done dynamic tolling. It's congestion pricing that some cities are exploring. So there's lots of ways to charge for road use that could help fund that infrastructure and also address some of the other challenges that we have managing our roadways. But some of these things take an awful long time, and I think that when you look at where the pilots are happening, they're happening on a state-by-state or in some cases a multi-state basis. So it is, I think, something that will have to start locally and build its way up to the top. The federal government can play, I think, an important role in coordinating those efforts, making sure that it's transferable and those kind of things, so we don't have every state with its totally unique and incompatible systems. But it could be a pretty good way to raise revenue, particularly at the state level. But there is going to be tremendous amount of administrative costs, privacy concerns, some of the things that Murphie talked about that are limitations that aren't for gas taxes, right? Gas taxes are one of the easiest taxes to collect and administer, whereas VMT fees are going to be very, very difficult to do that. And so, and it's not necessarily a ton of revenue on a per user basis, right? In net, it gets a lot, but the fuel tax, the federal fuel taxes for a typical American driver end up being about $6 a month. We're not talking about a tremendous amount of revenue on a per user basis, but in net, it does end up being a lot. And the question is, what does it mean to put a transponder in every single car and administer that and manage the accounts and make sure people are collecting those kind of things? And how high are we going to set the fees so that that makes that effort worth it? And that's when I think it's going to be challenging. But it is certainly a compelling idea and definitely something that we want to see more research and action and pilots on.
Great. So maybe switching back to a topic that kind of came up in kind of the lay of the land question, and that is the impact of COVID-19. I don't think it's a surprise that many of us, including myself, I'm currently calling in from my house, are doing a lot less commuting. And so one of the differences between kind of the House and the Senate bill was the amount of funding for public transit. And I don't think I'm, kind of speaking too far out of turn when I say that, what is largely expected to be a kind of ongoing significant decrease in transit use. So Murphie, maybe I'll throw this one to you. How should we view the federal role to support large and small transit systems going forward, kind of given what we are seeing, in terms of the impact on transit from COVID-19?
So, I think the short answer is we don't quite know yet. And let me try to explain that. So I don't think at this point, based on the legislative proposals that we've seen in the Senate predominantly, we didn't actually see a proposal, as I mentioned, from Senate banking, but fully expected them to continue providing federal funding for public transit programs. It's really unlikely that we'll see any fundamental shifts in both federal transit policies, programs, and any large decreases in funding in the near term. And part of that, I think, is driven, by the fact that, a lot of the Democrats in both the House and the Senate, really do have an overarching, policy principle or objective to deal with greenhouse gas emissions and to reduce those and to start, to address the effects of climate change. And the transportation sector plays a significant role in emitting greenhouse gas emissions. So, one of the ways that we saw, the House in particular try to address this issue and a little bit within the Senate highway proposal was to kind of encourage the shifting of people from a single occupancy vehicle to public transit or another environmentally friendly mode of transportation. And that's really sort of, as I said, a cornerstone of something that both House and Senate Democrats want to achieve, with federal surface transportation policies and programs. So given that, I don't expect, that cornerstone to change anytime soon. I think we're going to continue to see federal funding for public transit systems and the overarching programs largely remain intact. That's not to say that as we look to the future of federal surface transportation policy, that changes shouldn't be considered. And I think I would guess that a lot of those changes may be more likely to occur in the years ahead at the state and local level as public officials sort of look at the different needs of their constituents and how best to address those transportation needs going forward. And to be honest with you, the federal and state, the state and local governments really are a lot of the incubators for a lot of the future ideas that bubble up to the federal level for transportation. And I think if those changes start to occur at the state and local level, you'd be more likely to see some bigger changes undertaken at the federal level. In addition, I think, we are very much still in the midst of this pandemic, and I don't think we'll fully understand the fundamental shifts that are occurring in terms of how people get to work, where they work, how kids go to school, how we travel, for quite some time. And so I think once we have an opportunity to kind of really collect that data and look back on the impact of the pandemic, there'll be a better basis for the federal government to consider any changes related to federal public transit programs.
Paul, anything to add? I know you brought up, obviously, the potential for additional transit aid. Should we see another iteration of a COVID stimulus? So obviously, I know you've been plugged into that.
Yeah. So, I think the way to think about COVID and as it relates to surface transportation is both on the operating side and on the capital side. And on the operating side, the situation, especially in public transit, is pretty dire. A couple of months ago, through the CARES Act, transit agencies got a lot of funding, but the way that that those funds were distributed using some of the existing formulas didn't necessarily match up with how transit agencies fund themselves, right? And then if you look at the different breakdowns of revenues, whether it be federal funds, which have been pretty stable, state and local taxes, which have been a little shaky, and passenger revenues, which have totally plummeted, it can vary where the transit agency's operations are reliant on maybe 10% on passenger revenues, up to 90% of their operations on passenger revenues, and some agencies are in real trouble, while others don't seem to be complaining quite as loud. So I think there will be more funding needed to help close some of the operational gaps. But how that's distributed and perhaps giving some discretion to the FTA to target it to the regions, New York in particular, but some of the other big regions, is a good step forward. Politically challenging, of course, but the bottom line, while transit's carrying an awful lot fewer passengers than it was a few months ago, there's still, on most bus systems, ridership's down 30, 40, 50% instead of the 90+% we've seen on some of the rail and commuter rail systems, which goes to show that there's despite the pandemic, but despite the risk, there's an awful lot of people that need to get to those essential jobs on public transit, and there's a pretty strong rationale for the federal government stepping into making sure that that part of the economy is running. And on the highway side too, I mean, there's plenty of things that we're going to look into this winter. There's a lot of operational needs, a lot of maintenance needs as it relates to running a highway network that states might need some operating assistance as well. How that plays out this fall, I'm not sure. But looking into the future, right? What is kind of the next thing, and then this is where the capital side comes into play, which is most of the federal program. I think that we may see, and maybe this is reflected in a bill that comes out next year, much more of an emphasis and much more funding readily available for state of good repair and maintenance work in a way that wasn't in the past. Certainly in transit with decreased ridership and perhaps decreased ridership that persists for a long time, paring back new projects to expand the system may not be as important as fixing the system that we have. And so there may be some new requirements and new funding really targeted towards state of good repair. And same goes for the highway system. We saw VMT plummet 40% in April, and it's recovered. And I think the most recent numbers, which are July, VMT was down 11.5%. And if we extrapolate that and use the VMT data is not updated as regularly as the refineries. So if we use the fuel production from refineries as a proxy for VMT, it stayed at about 10, 11, 12% down from it was a year ago. And so we've kind of stabilized our surface transportation network on the highway side at about 10% lower than we were pre-pandemic levels. And if there's any transportation planners and demand management folks on the phone, you certainly know that a 10% reduction in highway volumes can mean the difference between gridlock and free flow traffic. 10% can have a huge difference, and it can also mean, whether a widening project or an interchange or something is worth it or not. And so I think also on the highway side, a renewed emphasis that, again, has been building for a long time, both on the right and on the left, focused on fix it first rather than capital expansion, could be a long-term result of COVID-19 and this reset on how we think about transportation investments.
Thanks. I mean, I will say, on the few times that I've had to go into the office over the past 6 months, it has taken me, the increase in speed that I have been able to sustain between my house and the Capitol has been unlike anything I've ever experienced. So I guess my last question on kind of the impact of COVID-19, and Murphie, this to you, because I know that AGC worked with our partners over at AASHTO, and for those that aren't familiar, AASHTO is the American Association of State Transportation and Highway Officials, so state DOTs. I know you worked with them on a letter and campaign, on aid for states and transit agencies in response to COVID. So I guess maybe just how'd it go? What was the response from members of Congress, both in the House and the Senate?
So yeah, no, I think AGC really did enjoy working with our other partners here in town on making the case for the state DOT funding request, which is now at $37 billion. There was a much larger group of us that came together to not only support the state DOT funding request, but also the public transit request that Paul's mentioned, which is currently sitting at about $32 billion. I think this is, one of the big unanswered questions. Is Congress going to come together at any point this fall and restart their negotiations to try to put together another COVID-19 relief package? I think some form of funding will be included if that package comes together for transportation, but the question will be, who is it for and how does Congress provide it? There are rumors swirling here in Washington, and it changes a minute, and it might have already changed in the time that we've been on the phone together with you all, but, there was...
I'm sure it has.
Some press... I'm sure it has, so I apologize for my inaccurate information. But, there were some press reports a short while ago this afternoon that Chairman Richard Neal, who heads the House Ways and Means Committee, which is the tax writing committee in the House, was putting together, approximately $2 trillion package. For those who've been tracking this closely, that the House's most recent proposal was north of $3 trillion. So they've shaved $1 trillion, and it's possible, according to the press reports, that we could see this new version of their proposal next week, and they could vote on it next week before recessing for the election. But as everyone knows, sort of if the pie is shrinking from $3 trillion, in this case, down to approximately $2 trillion, some things are going to have to get left on the cutting room floor. And only the top congressional negotiators know what those things might be. On the state DOT funding request, we had more than 137 members of Congress write to their respective leaders urging them to provide funding for state DOTs. We had a similar effort in the Senate where I believe, if my memory serves me correctly, we had about 27 bipartisan senators make a similar ask of their respective leaders. So I think there is congressional support for this. There's obviously congressional support for the public transit agencies. There's a lot of congressional support also for the aviation industry, both the airports and the airlines, whether those are passenger and cargo carrying airlines. There's lots of other facets of the transportation sector that are hurting as a result of the pandemic, much like any other industry in this country right now and the American people. So, I think time will tell, but things are going to get left behind if we're going to spend less than $3 trillion, and Congress may decide to grant or address some issues through existing flexibility with, either current or future money that they've provided to state and local governments.
Well, I will have to check Twitter after we end this call because I had not seen that news. So thank you for the heads up. So before I ask the next question, just a reminder to all of our attendees, if you do have a question you'd like answered, I've got some more, of course, but feel free to just throw them out in the chat, and I will make sure that I put our two speakers on the spot. So turning away from kind of the revenue issue, I want to dig into, and I always do that, nice transportation pun there, dig into the issue of project permitting. So in this Congress, obviously, we have the House being controlled by the Democratic Party and the Senate being controlled by the Republican Party. Let's just assume for this question that in the 117th in 2021, those facts remain. So Paul, maybe I'll start with you. Is this an area, project permitting, where we can see compromise, or are we really kind of going to be stuck with talking points in this issue for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's actually something that we've launched, a big project here at Eno, looking at the high cost and long timelines of projects. Specifically, we kind of kept our scope on transit projects, but highways are also included in that in the U.S., particularly as it relates to other countries. And basically, why does it take other countries much less time and much less money to build similar projects? And so we're spending a lot of time this fall and winter doing that research. Unfortunately, I don't have the outcomes yet, but we are looking at project permitting and NEPA as part of that process. And I think that there are some certain things within the NEPA process that can be streamlined, and we can address some of these issues. In other times, I feel like NEPA is kind of a scapegoat, and we're barking up the wrong tree when we're trying to find ways to compress timelines and move permitting forward. I think it'll continue to be an issue and it'll continue to be something we talk about here in Washington, and probably for good reason, because it's been a long time since we've made substantial changes to NEPA and how we permit projects, and there probably are a lot of efficiencies we can make, and some things that we're hoping to uncover with our research. And I expect it to continue to be something, because there is bipartisan support for making sure projects can move forward as quickly as possible, so long as the protections that are needed remain in place.
And Murphie, maybe before I kind of throw this to you, one caveat. I know you obviously worked closely on this issue as part of the FAST Act. Are some of the provisions that were included in the FAST Act, have they showed up kind of making a difference in that, or that being the length of time it takes to permit projects, or is this an area where as Paul said, sometimes it's a scapegoat, sometimes it's correctly identified?
So I'll take your first part of your question. I'll try to answer that one. So, I think we are seeing some benefits associated with not only the project delivery streamlining provisions that were in the FAST Act, but we're also, in MAP 21. Those two bills are certainly not the first to try to address this issue. We've sort of had a long history of trying to do that, and the legislation, kind of builds on previous bills. I think, a lot of the challenges associated with this, and it sounds like Eno's work will be helpful on this front, is there hasn't been enough or as robust data on what's really impacting a project from moving to sort of, identification of, the challenge and actually being, all the way built. Where are the biggest roadblocks occurring? Certainly from an AGC perspective, we do feel that there is always opportunities for Congress and the administration to evaluate further provisions or agency actions that could help address, project delivery delays. I think some of the challenges associated with whether or not are the existing reforms, quote unquote, working. A few years ago, it was, because quite frankly, they hadn't been implemented yet by the U.S. Department of Transportation. I think the Trump administration has made significant strides with implementing any of those remaining provisions that weren't implemented by the prior administration. Implementing these laws is a Herculean task. And one of the reforms that, I don't think we've really seen, but was certainly sort of a hard fought for provision, I guess I'll say, was the provision in the FAST Act where a state, if they had assumed the Federal Highway Administration's responsibilities under NEPA, they could, if they were admitted through this pilot program, substitute a comparable or more strenuous, state environmental law for NEPA. rather than trying to have, sort of those duplicative environmental review processes occurring. So, that is something that I think because that was such a big Republican priority, you'll continue to sort of see a lot of Republican interest in how that provision shakes out when it's actually used out in the field outside of Washington, D.C. But I do think, going forward under sort of the status quo situation that you laid out, Ben, improving project delivery, streamlining it while retaining appropriate environmental protections is going to continue to be something that Congress discusses, and I would anticipate that any ultimate agreement between the House and the Senate under sort of a status quo scenario right now will include something on this issue. There's enough sort of political support that would be a necessary component of a final agreement.
Great. So let me, I guess, kind of take everything that we've discussed over the past 45 minutes or so, and given, I think what most of us expect is a one-year extension of the FAST Act. So, Paul, maybe to you, what can we expect when the 117th Congress comes together in January? I know you touched on this earlier, but maybe some final comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it all depends on what happens in November, particularly watching the Senate. I don't think anyone's expecting the House to change, but the Senate is certainly in play. If it's split, then I think we're going to see very much a bipartisan bill. It's going to be, some tweaks to the program and some goodies for the right and some goodies for the left, but generally a bipartisan approach, not too terribly different from what we've seen before. And I think if we are going to see anything different, something that both the right and the left are particularly enamored with, is the growing interest in an emphasis on state of good repair. If the Democrats take control of the Senate, I think that it could be a much more interesting, to say the least, process of what could come out of that. And I think that infusing the climate change stuff, and that would be certainly elevated in my mind in that scenario. Again, probably a continued emphasis on the climate. On the state of repair, and probably more money. The Democrats have been consistently talking about more resources, more investment, and so a Democratic bill, I think, would likely include more money, and probably more of that going to transit than highways in the split, but not necessarily a decrease overall in the highway portion. But again, it's wild times right now, and I think it's really hard to predict what's exactly going to happen until the dust settles after November.
Murphy, same question to you.
So, I think one thing to consider as we try to kind of look into this, what is probably a very murky, cloud-filled crystal ball at the moment, is to think about, who some of the key players are going to be in Congress in the 117th. I certainly would agree that I don't think anyone's expecting the House to flip and go back to a Republican control. I think everyone expects it to retain in Democratic hands. On the House, in terms of the committees that will play this pivotal role in developing, either a large infrastructure package and or surface transportation reauthorization bill, the leadership both for the Democrats and the Republicans is not expected to change. I think the one committee where we are anticipating some changes is the House Appropriations Committee. The top Democrat is expected to change, and I don't think there's a clear front runner to the best of my knowledge yet. There are 3 female members of Congress that are currently kind of in the race for that top spot. On the Senate side, it is a different story. I mentioned earlier in our conversation that there are, 3 authorizing committees that have, a role to play in putting together a surface transportation reauthorization bill, and arguably a role to play in any larger infrastructure package. Of those, 3 authorizing committees, we're expecting changes on the Republican leadership front in two of those. We're anticipating that the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee leadership will change. The anticipated front runner is Senator Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia, although if you asked any of these senators if their hopes and dreams were to run any of these committees next Congress, they would politely tell you that they do not make a habit of measuring the drapes. The other committee that we are anticipating a change in leadership for the Republicans is the Senate Banking Committee, which, as I mentioned, has jurisdiction over federal public transit programs. And we anticipate that could possibly be Senator Toomey from a Republican from Pennsylvania. Senate Commerce Committee, we expect the leadership to stay the same with Chairman, we don't know if he'll be chairman or ranking member yet, but with Senator Wicker at the helm for Republicans. Finance Committee, which, I talked about earlier, that is also anticipated to have a change in Republican leadership. Right now, the thought is that would be Senator Crapo from Idaho. So I think it's important to kind of just make that note for you all, because anytime you have changes in leaderships on committees, there is just a time that needs to be devoted to kind of standing up those committees, getting the staffs in place, making sure there's an understanding of the leaders, policy priorities, et cetera. So I think, that'll kind of impact when and how we see something, on the Senate side. In terms of what we're going to see and how this quite possibly might play out, we really have to look at questions of how the bill's developed, what is the cost, how much, money are we providing, and the scope. We talked about it a little bit, but just to sort of crystallize this, I hope, for you all, the Senate really was kind of moving down a path of a traditional surface transportation reauthorization bill. And the Senate EPW committee also started moving forward on other infrastructure legislation, like a Water Resources Development Act. Those bills weren't, for the reasons we discussed, they weren't really ever sort of merged together on the Senate floor in some manner into a larger quote-unquote infrastructure package, right? They really took this more sort of methodical, traditional kind of piecemeal approach to deal with the nation's infrastructure needs. The House, on the other hand, as we discussed, did introduce a surface transportation reauthorization bill, the Invest in America Act. It's a $494 billion proposal over 5 years, which is a huge amount of money from the federal government's perspective, and fused it into a more than $1.5 trillion infrastructure package. And infrastructure was very broadly defined in that package to cover basically everything but the kitchen sink. And when you have the House and Senate taking different approaches in terms of how the bill's developed, is it bipartisan? Is it partisan? How much money are we spending? What is the cost associated with it? And just generally, what are we talking about when it comes to infrastructure? It makes it hard for the two chambers to actually find agreement ultimately and get something to the president's desk. So I think one of the things that Congress will have to tackle is answering all these questions in the 117th Congress. And if you're in a status quo scenario where you have the House Democrats in control and the Senate stays Republican, we might want to, hope that they return to a more sort of piece by piece, bill by bill approach to dealing with infrastructure, or else I think we could run the risk of, unfortunately, seeing ourselves in this sort of stalled environment that we have right now. On the other hand, if we have a blue wave and the Senate does flip and become Democrats, I think largely all bets are off. I think this will be a great opportunity for the Democrats to do something big and visionary on infrastructure, both from a funding standpoint, but also in terms of really laying the groundwork for, some fundamental changes as it relates to federal infrastructure policies and programs. Paul mentioned climate change, state of good repair, also dealing with environmental justice issues, other things that up until this point, I don't think had really sort of been fully addressed or contemplated, when folks were putting together prior infrastructure bills. So time will tell. Hopefully our crystal ball will become much clearer after the election in November, and we'll have a better sense of what the lay of the land will really look like for the 117th.
Well, we're going to have you both back on a year from today, and we will play this back and see how we did. No.
See how wrong we were.
So I've got 357, and since I know we all are busier than we want to be these days, please join me in extending a final thank you to our two panelists today. NCSL and I personally greatly appreciate the expertise that you were each able to provide, and of course the time that you took out of your busy schedules to join us today. And of course, thanks to all of you, our attendees, for participating in today's webinar. And as a reminder, a recording of today's discussion and the slides, if you'd like, will be made available shortly. The next webinar in our series will be in 2 weeks, same day, same time, Thursday, October 8th at 3 p.m. And we are going to have a discussion on climate action and agriculture. So slightly different topic than today. But to register or find out more information, please visit ncsl.org, or you can just simply send me an email. I will be your moderator for that webinar as well. So again, thank you for your continued interest and support of NCSL, and I wish everyone a great rest of their week and a relaxing and cool weekend.
Thanks, Ben. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Murphy.